She had always been told she was not meant for battle, that her place was behind walls or in the quiet corners of strategy rooms, where blood was measured in numbers and victory in lines on a map, not in the screams of soldiers or the clash of steel. But Alira had never been the kind to accept chains when the world demanded courage, and though the commanders dismissed her, though her peers whispered that she was fragile, too slow, too inexperienced, she carried within her a flame that none of them could see, a determination that no insult could extinguish. And when the war reached its most brutal hour, when the enemy's banners darkened the horizon and the defenses of her homeland crumbled one after another, it was she who found herself standing where no one else would. The day had begun with thunder in the skies, not of storms but of cannon fire, each blast shaking the ground until even the most hardened men flinched, and the air smelled of smoke and despair, the city's gates trembling as the invading horde pressed closer, and soldiers retreated step by step, some with wounds bleeding freely, others with fear gnawing at their hearts until they could no longer grip their swords, and in the chaos of it all Alira felt the sharp sting of the words that had followed her for years, unfit, unworthy, incapable, but those words did not bind her as chains. They sharpened within her chest like a blade honed for the moment it would be needed, and as the last defensive line faltered, she took her place among them, though no one had asked her to. The captain had already ordered a retreat, his voice breaking with the weight of what was about to be lost, and many obeyed, running for the inner walls, abandoning the outer defenses that had once stood proud, but Alira did not move, her hands gripping the hilt of her sword until her knuckles burned white, her eyes fixed on the storm of enemies pouring toward the broken gate. And in that instant she made a choice that none could unmake, to stand where everyone else had fled, to hold where no one believed holding was possible. Around her the earth was littered with broken shields and discarded spears, the bodies of comrades who had fought until death stole their strength, and the silence of their sacrifice pressed heavy on her chest. Yet it gave her something more than grief, it gave her resolve, for she could not let their struggle vanish into nothing, she could not let their blood be spilled only to water the soil beneath an enemy's boots. And so she lifted her blade high though her arms trembled, though her lungs burned with smoke, and she shouted into the roar of war words no one expected, a cry that was less about courage and more about defiance, a vow that she would not move, that she would not yield, that if the city fell it would fall only after she had given every last breath to keep it standing. The enemy saw her, a lone figure against a broken wall, and laughter echoed from their ranks, mocking the absurdity of one woman standing where hundreds had fallen. But still they came, rushing forward with steel and rage, and Alira met them not with fear but with fury, her blade singing as it clashed against the first, sparks flying as she struck down the soldier who thought her weak, blood staining the stones beneath her boots as she pushed back against the tide, and though the world narrowed to the rhythm of battle, though every strike rattled her bones and every wound carved lines of fire across her flesh, she did not falter. Memories flashed in fragments between each breath, the nights she had spent alone training in silence when others slept, the insults hurled at her in the barracks, the cold stares of commanders who dismissed her without thought, and all of them burned away into something fierce, a strength that was not measured in muscle but in will, and as she fought, as she endured, her defiance became something greater than her own survival. It became a beacon for those who watched from the shadows of the retreat, soldiers who had once abandoned their posts pausing to see the woman they had mocked standing alone against a flood of enemies, holding the line not with power but with unbreakable spirit, and in that sight they felt shame, then fire, then something that pulled them back from the grip of fear. Step by step some returned, gathering what weapons they could, finding courage where they thought it had died, and slowly the line that had shattered began to form again, not because of orders or hope of victory, but because one soul refused to bend. Alira felt their presence at her side even as exhaustion clawed at her veins, but she did not look back, did not waste a breath on words of command or thanks, for her focus remained on the endless tide before her, each enemy that fell proof that her worth was not dictated by the doubts of others but by the choices she made, and in those choices she found freedom. Her arms ached, her body screamed, and blood dripped from wounds that would not heal, but still she fought, every heartbeat louder than the drums of war, every swing of her sword a statement to the world that she was not unfit, that she was not weak, that she was more than what they had said, and though the night stretched long and merciless, though the sky burned red with fire, she held, alone at first, then not so alone, but always at the heart of it all, the one who stood when all others had fallen. The battle raged without pause, and though Alira's body threatened to collapse beneath the relentless weight of steel and fire, she forced herself onward, her breaths ragged but steady enough to fuel the strength in her arms. And with each clash she realized she was no longer just a fighter trying to defend a wall, she had become the very spirit of resistance, the living embodiment of a city's last hope. And even as blades scraped her armor and arrows grazed her skin, she refused to retreat. Her mind locked on the simple truth that if she gave in now, everything that had been lost already would have been for nothing, and that truth burned hotter than the pain. Around her more soldiers who had once abandoned the fight now began to gather, drawn not by command but by the undeniable sight of her defiance, and with each man and woman who returned the broken line became less fragile, yet even then they looked to her, not to captains or banners, because she was the one who had stood first when all else had failed, and though she had never sought leadership, though she had been denied it her entire life, in that moment it was hers, born not from rank but from the raw power of example. The enemy pressed harder, realizing the defenders had not completely shattered, and their war horns blared across the night, a sound meant to crush the spirit, but Alira answered with nothing more than a swing of her blade that dropped another foe to the ground, a sound of steel against flesh echoing louder than horns in the hearts of those beside her. And still she stood tall, every movement a declaration that this wall would not break. Time lost meaning as the hours dragged by, each minute feeling like a lifetime, each heartbeat a victory in itself, and yet Alira did not falter, even as exhaustion became a constant shadow, even as her arms grew heavy and her legs trembled, for something greater carried her forward, a force not physical but unyielding, the will to prove that she was not what they called her, that she was not unfit, that in the crucible of fire she was tempered into steel. At one point the enemy surged with such fury that the ground seemed to shake. Their armored giants pushing through with hammers that shattered shields and scattered defenders, and for an instant the line seemed ready to crumble again, but Alira stepped forward without hesitation, her sword clashing against one of the towering warriors, sparks flying as steel met steel, her smaller frame dwarfed by the monster before her, yet she did not yield an inch, her strikes fierce and precise, her movements born of countless nights of practice no one had valued, and in that clash, she became more than herself, she became the voice of every forgotten fighter, every underestimated soul, and when the giant fell to her blade the defenders roared with new strength, a roar that pushed back against despair and sent tremors through the enemy ranks. Still, victory was not near, for the enemy came in endless waves, and with each wave Alira felt her body breaking further, her blood soaking the ground until she could barely tell which wounds were new and which had already scarred, but she would not allow herself to fall, not while others still fought beside her, not while the city still breathed behind the walls, and so she pressed on, her mind narrowing to nothing but the next strike, the next breath, the next heartbeat, her very existence boiled down to the act of holding the line. Soldiers began to whisper her name between gasps as though saying it aloud gave them strength, and though she did not hear every voice, the sound carried through the chaos, binding them together in a way no general's orders ever had, and slowly the tide that had seemed unstoppable began to slow, the enemy realizing that the defenders they thought broken now fought with a ferocity beyond reason, that the wall they had nearly taken now stood stronger than before, all because of one woman they had once mocked. The night stretched into dawn, the red glow of fire giving way to the pale light of morning, and still Alira fought, her body now a collection of wounds and scars but her spirit blazing brighter than the sun rising behind her, and when the horns of the enemy finally called for retreat, when their commanders realized that this city would not fall as easily as they believed, the defenders let out cries that shook the heavens, cries of survival, cries of triumph, and at the center of it all Alira remained standing, her sword dripping with blood, her chest heaving with exhaustion, but her eyes fierce and unbroken. Yet even as the battle ended, even as the enemy withdrew to regroup, Alira knew this was not the end, for wars did not end in a single night, and she could feel in her bones that greater storms loomed beyond the horizon, but she also knew something else, something unshakable, that she had proven herself not only to others but to herself, that she had shown the world she was not unfit, that her place was not in the shadows or the safety of walls but on the line where courage mattered most, and no voice could ever again take that truth away from her. She did not collapse though her body begged her to, she did not cry though the weight of what had been endured pressed heavily upon her chest, she simply stood among the fallen, watching the dawn rise over a battlefield that smelled of blood and smoke, knowing that her journey was only beginning, and that her role in this war was no longer one of doubt but of undeniable strength. The morning after the battle carried with it a silence heavier than the clash of swords, a silence filled with the weight of what had been endured, the cries of the wounded drifting faintly through the broken streets, and Alira walked among them not as a commander or a celebrated hero but as one of their own, blood still drying on her armor, her steps unsteady yet unyielding, and though every muscle in her body screamed for rest she refused to sit down, for she knew the sight of her standing gave strength to those who could no longer rise, and they looked at her with eyes that carried something different. Now, not doubt, not mockery, but reverence, as if they had seen something in her that even she had not fully known existed, and though she did not bask in it, though she did not crave their admiration, she accepted the responsibility it carried. The captains who had once dismissed her now approached cautiously, their faces marked by guilt and awe, and though they did not speak at first, their silence confessed what their pride would not allow them to say, that she had done what they could not, that she had stood where they had fled, and when one finally found the courage to murmur a broken apology, she only shook her head, for she did not need words, she did not fight for their approval, she fought for something greater, for the city, for the fallen, for the truth that no one had the right to decide who was worthy of battle. Yet despite the retreat of the enemy, the war was far from over, scouts bringing news of fresh forces gathering beyond the hills, stronger armies preparing for another strike, and the weight of it pressed down upon everyone like a shadow, their brief moment of triumph threatened by the storm to come. But Elira did not let despair settle. Instead she moved through the ranks, speaking little but offering her presence, her silent defiance reminding them that if one night of hell could be survived, then perhaps another could too, and in this way she gave them more than hope, she gave them conviction. As days passed, the city prepared for the inevitable, walls hastily repaired with whatever stone and timber could be gathered, weapons reforged from broken steel, and though the work was desperate and weary, the people labored with renewed will, their eyes often turning to Elira as though she was a pillar holding the sky itself, and though she felt the burden of their expectations pressing down, she did not crumble beneath it, for she had already chosen her path and there was no turning back. Now, at night she trained, though her wounds ached and her body begged for rest, the sound of her blade slicing through the air a rhythm that steadied her mind, and in those hours alone she faced the memories that haunted her, the voices that had once called her weak, the shadows of comrades who had fallen while she survived, and she vowed again and again that their deaths would not be meaningless, that she would carry them into every battle yet to come. The soldiers began to train with her, one by one at first, then in greater numbers, their shame slowly transforming into respect, and though she offered no lectures, no long speeches, she taught them through her movements, her relentless drive, her refusal to bend, and soon the barracks echoed with the sound of warriors remade not by fear but by fire, each of them feeding on the strength she exuded. Still, Elira knew the storm would not be held back by courage alone, and the memory of the giants she had faced lingered in her thoughts, a reminder that the enemy was no ordinary force but one bred for destruction, and as scouts confirmed the approach of siege engines and battalions larger than anything they had yet endured, whispers of despair returned, even among the bravest, yet again she refused to let it fester, for she understood that the greatest weapon the enemy wielded was not steel, but fear, and to shatter that weapon she needed only to remain unbroken. On the eve of the second assault she climbed to the walls, looking out across the horizon where the dark mass of the enemy campfires stretched like a sea of stars inverted, and for the first time she allowed herself a long breath, steadying the storm in her heart, knowing that what was to come would test her beyond even the night she had already survived, but knowing also that she had become something she had never dreamed she could be, a symbol that even her enemies could no longer ignore. She did not pray, for the gods had never spoken to her, but she whispered a promise into the wind, a promise to those who had fallen and to those who still stood, that she would not falter, that she would hold again, even if the price was her life. And as dawn broke and the horns of war echoed once more across the valley, she gripped her sword, her body trembling not from fear but from the weight of destiny, and when the gates shook under the first strike of the enemy's rams, she was the first to raise her blade, the first to call out to her people, her voice fierce and unwavering, a rallying cry that swept through the defenders like fire through dry grass, reminding them that though the enemy outnumbered them, though the world called them weak, they were not broken, not while she still stood. The second battle began with thunder that shook the very bones of the city, siege engines hurling boulders that shattered against the walls, towers of fire rolling through the sky like falling stars, and beneath it all the enemy surged forward in an endless tide, their voices rising in a chorus of fury meant to drown hope before swords ever crossed. Yet atop the wall Elira stood unflinching, her eyes steady as the ground quaked and the defenders trembled, her presence alone a defiance greater than any stone could break, and when the first wave of ladders slammed against the ramparts she was the first to strike, cutting down the enemy climbers before their boots could find purchase. Her blade a blur of steel and firelight as she moved with a precision born not of training halls but of desperation and will. Around her the defenders fought with renewed vigor, feeding on her strength, each cry she gave answered by a chorus of their own, and though the enemy came harder, stronger, with armored beasts that crushed men beneath their weight, Elira never faltered, leaping into the chaos with a fury that left even her allies breathless, for they saw in her not a woman or a soldier but a force of nature, unyielding and relentless, a storm that stood between them and annihilation. Hours bled together as the battle raged, smoke burning the sky until day became night, and blood soaked the stones until they ran slick, yet still Illyra pressed on, her body cut and bruised but her spirit unbroken, and in every clash she reminded her people that strength was not in numbers but in resolve, that no army could crush a heart that refused to bend. At one point the enemy breached a section of the wall, pouring through like a flood, and panic spread among the defenders as the streets filled with screams, but Illyra rushed forward before despair could claim them, rallying a small band to her side, and together they fought street by street, corner by corner, turning every stone into a weapon, every alley into a fortress, until the tide was slowed, then turned, their blood buying each precious heartbeat of survival. She felt the weight of every life on her shoulders, the agony of every loss cutting deeper than any wound, but she bore it without hesitation, for she understood that leadership was not about command but about sacrifice, and as long as she stood others would stand too. The enemy commanders saw it as well, saw how their endless waves faltered each time she appeared, how their soldiers hesitated when her blade struck down their strongest, and so they marked her, sending their champions against her in hopes of breaking the spirit she had become. Yet each duel only forged her legend further, her sword clashing against warlords and monsters alike, her body screaming with pain but her will burning brighter than ever, until even the enemy began to whisper her name, with fear. Still, the battle had no mercy, and as dusk fell over the blood-soaked city the enemy unleashed their final assault, battering rams smashing through the gates, siege towers pouring soldiers onto the walls, and for a moment it seemed as though the defenders would at last collapse, too few, too broken to withstand the storm, but Illyra refused to yield, driving herself into the heart of the breach, her blade carving a path through the chaos, her cries of defiance louder than the horns of war, and the defenders, seeing her stand where death itself reigned, rallied once more, their fear burned away by the fire of her unshakable resolve. The clash became a storm of steel and flesh, every heartbeat a battle of its own, and though Illyra's arms grew heavy, though blood poured from wounds that would have felled another, she fought on, every strike fueled by the knowledge that this was her purpose, that this was why she had endured years of doubt and scorn, to stand here now, when the world demanded someone unbreakable. Hours passed until night swallowed the city, and still the line held, not because of fortifications or numbers but because of her, because one woman had refused to surrender when all seemed lost, and the enemy, though vast and merciless, began to falter, their will tested against something they could not understand, a spirit that would not bow. At last, as the moon rose high and pale above the smoke, the horns of retreat sounded once more, the enemy dragging back their dead and their broken, their siege engines left smoldering in ruin, and the city stood, battered and bloodied but unfallen, its people raising their voices in cries that shook the night, cries not of victory but of survival, of defiance, of unyielding will, and at the center of it all Illyra collapsed to her knees, her sword slipping from bloodied hands, her breath ragged and shallow, yet even then she raised her head, her eyes fierce and unbroken, and the people who gathered around her knew beyond doubt that their city still stood because she had chosen to stand alone when no one else would. The night after the second battle was a night of fire and shadows, the city trembling under the weight of silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the quiet sobs of those who mourned the dead, and though the people had survived, though the enemy had been driven back once more, the cost was carved deep into every heart, the streets littered with broken bodies and the walls cracked beyond repair, yet through all the ruin Illyra walked, her steps slow but steady, her body bleeding with wounds that should have forced her into rest but her spirit carrying her forward, because she knew that if she showed weakness now, if she allowed herself to collapse, the fragile hope holding her people together would shatter, and so she stood tall, her eyes burning with the same fire that had carried her through battle, a fire that no wound could extinguish. As she passed through the ruins, men and women reached out to her, touching her arm, whispering her name, their gazes filled not with pity but with reverence, for they had seen what she had done, they had watched her hold the line when all seemed lost, and to them she was no longer just a soldier but the living embodiment of defiance itself, and though she felt the crushing weight of their faith pressing onto her shoulders, she bore it without complaint, for she understood now that her life was no longer her own, it belonged to the people, to the city, to the fallen whose blood cried out for meaning. The captains and council met in the shattered hall that night, their faces grim as they argued over the future, some demanding surrender, others urging retreat to safer lands, but when Illyra entered the chamber their voices faltered, silenced not by command but by the undeniable presence of the one who had done what none of them could, and when they asked her what should be done she did not give them speeches or flowery words, She simply told them the truth that the enemy would return, that the city could not run, and that as long as a single defender drew breath the line would be held, because surrender would mean not survival but slavery, not peace but chains, and though her words were simple they struck deeper than any argument, and one by one the council bowed their heads, ashamed yet convinced, and agreed to fight on. In the days that followed the city became a forge of resilience. Every able hand turned to rebuilding the walls, sharpening blades, gathering supplies, and though despair lurked at the edges of every mind, Alira's presence banished it, for she walked among them daily, working beside them, training with them, bleeding with them, never once setting herself above, and in this way she bound them together, not as soldiers following orders but as a people united by choice. Children who once hid in fear now followed her in the streets, imitating her movements with wooden sticks, their laughter a fragile but powerful song that gave the weary strength, and the old told stories of her nights on the wall, their voices turning her struggle into legend before her eyes, though she herself rejected the word, for she did not see herself as a hero, only as someone who refused to yield when it mattered most. Yet even as the city healed, scouts brought darker news. The enemy had not abandoned their conquest, they had gathered allies, forces greater than ever before, an army vast enough to drown the land in blood. And with every report the shadow of doom grew heavier, whispers spreading that no courage could stand against such numbers, that even Alira could not hold forever, and in the quiet hours she felt the weight of those whispers pressing into her own heart, a whisper of doubt she had long silenced but could not fully kill, yet when dawn came she buried it beneath her resolve, for doubt was a poison she could not afford, not when so many looked to her. One evening, standing atop the wall as the sun bled red into the horizon, she closed her eyes and let the wind wash over her, remembering the faces of the fallen, the comrades who had once laughed at her, who had called her unfit, and yet whose blood now mingled with hers on the stones of the battlefield, and she whispered a vow to them that when the storm came again she would meet it, no matter the cost, because to live in chains was worse than to die in freedom, and in that vow she found the strength to keep standing. The people too seemed to sense what was coming, and though fear lingered they chose to fight, because she had shown them that one unbroken spirit could stand against a tide, and if she could do it then perhaps they could too, and in their eyes she saw not despair but fire, a fire that mirrored her own. And so the city prepared, not for survival but for defiance, every street readied as a fortress, every heart steeled for the storm, and at the center of it all Alira remained, a solitary figure who had been called unfit for battle but who had become the shield of her people, the line that would not break. And though she knew the next assault would be greater than anything she had yet endured, she also knew that she would face it the only way she knew how, by standing when all else fell, by holding the line even if she had to do so alone. The dawn that followed was unlike any morning before it. Smoke still lingered across the field, faint and drifting, like whispers of the violence that had taken place only hours ago. The bodies of the fallen, both friend and foe, lay scattered across the scarred earth, and the air smelled of ash and iron. Yet, against this backdrop of ruin, there was also a silence that felt strange, almost reverent, as though the very world itself paused to acknowledge what had happened. At the heart of it all stood Alira, her armor dented, her blade dulled and stained, her body exhausted, but her spirit unbroken. She had done what none believed possible. She had stood alone, when everyone called her unfit, unworthy, incapable, and she had held the line against the storm. Her hands trembled as she leaned on her sword, her legs barely carrying her, but her eyes never faltered. She looked over the field not with pride or arrogance, but with a quiet sorrow, knowing the cost of what had been achieved. The line had not broken because of her, but the price of that miracle was written in the blood that soaked the ground. When the soldiers who had fled returned, they did so slowly, almost fearfully, as if afraid of what they might find. They expected devastation, the banner torn down, their comrades slaughtered, the enemy triumphant. Instead they found Alira still standing, her body surrounded by the fallen. The sight stopped them in their tracks. The men and women who had doubted her, who had mocked her during training, who had whispered that she had no place on the battlefield, now saw her as something else entirely. Whispers spread among them as they approached, words like impossible, miracle, savior. Some dropped their weapons in shame, others fell to their knees in gratitude, but all of them felt the weight of her defiance and the proof of her strength. Alira said nothing to them, offered no grand speech, no accusation, no reminder of their betrayal. She simply turned her gaze to the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, and she whispered under her breath that the line had held. Her commanders came soon after, their expressions unreadable as they took in the scene. Men who had questioned her every move, who had thought her too reckless, too emotional, too weak to lead, now had no choice but to acknowledge what they saw. One of them, a hardened general with scars across his face, dismounted his horse and walked toward her. For a long moment he said nothing, simply observing her, the ruined battlefield and the impossible outcome. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, he drew his sword not to challenge her, but to present it in salute, the gesture of highest honor among their people. One by one the other commanders followed, until the field was filled with the sight of raised blades, all pointed not at her but toward the sky in respect. For Alira the gesture was overwhelming, not because she craved their recognition, but because it meant they finally saw her, not as a burden, not as someone unfit, but as a warrior who had earned her place through fire and blood. Despite the recognition, Alira did not feel triumphant. Her thoughts wandered to those who had fallen beside her, the few who had remained when the others fled. She remembered their names, their voices, their courage. She could still hear the sound of their last cries, still see their faces lit by the flames of battle. They had not survived, and yet their sacrifice had helped her stand. Without them she might not have lasted as long as she did. The memory of their bravery weighed heavily on her heart. She vowed silently that their sacrifice would not be forgotten, that their names would be remembered as long as she drew breath. Victory, she realized, was not about glory or recognition. It was about carrying forward the memory of those who had given everything. As the army reformed, the news of what had happened spread like wildfire. Stories of the lone warrior who held the line against impossible odds traveled from soldier to soldier, then to the nearby towns, then across the land. Some called her a hero, others whispered that she was blessed by the gods, a chosen one destined for greatness. To Alira these words meant little. She had not fought for titles or recognition. She had fought because the line needed to be held, because there was no one else who would. Yet she knew the story would grow beyond her control, exaggerated and reshaped into legend. The truth, that she was only a woman who refused to bend when others doubted her, would be buried beneath myth. Still, she accepted it, for if the legend inspired others to find strength within themselves, then perhaps it was worth it. The days that followed were filled with both mourning and rebuilding. Graves were dug for the fallen and fires burned to cleanse the battlefield. Alira took part in these tasks, not as a commander or a symbol, but as a soldier among soldiers. She carried bodies, cleaned weapons, patched wounds, and shared meals in silence. Her presence inspired those around her, not because she demanded respect, but because she worked beside them without complaint, as one of them. Slowly the army that had once doubted her began to rally around her, not out of obligation but out of loyalty and belief. She had earned something far stronger than command. She had earned their trust. One evening, as the campfires flickered in the dark, a young recruit approached her. He was trembling, his voice unsteady, but his eyes filled with determination. He told her that when he fled during the battle, he had believed she would die and the line would fall. He confessed his shame, his regret, and his fear. Then he asked her how she had found the strength to stay when everyone else left. Alira looked at him for a long moment before answering. She told him the truth, that strength was not about being fearless, but about refusing to give in even when fear consumed you. She explained that courage was not something you were born with, but something you chose in the moment it was needed most. The recruit nodded, tears in his eyes, and promised he would never run again. For Alira, his words meant more than the salutes of generals or the cheers of crowds, because they proved that what she had done had given someone else the courage to stand. Yet even as the camp healed, Alira knew the war was far from over. The enemy had been pushed back, but they would return. She had won a battle, not the war. The line would need to be held again and again until the land was safe. Her part in the struggle was not finished. In many ways, it had only just begun. Still, as she looked at the soldiers around her, she felt a shift. They no longer saw her as unfit or incapable. They saw her as one of their own, someone who would stand beside them no matter what. That bond, she realized, was the true strength that would carry them forward. She had stood alone once, but she would not have to stand alone again. The weeks that followed brought little rest, for though the army had won a moment of survival, the war loomed like a shadow that refused to lift. Scouts returned with grim reports, saying the enemy was gathering once again, larger and more organized than before, their banners rising like black fire along the horizon. The commanders called council after council, debating how to defend the fractured borders and how to mend an army still scarred by fear. In every council Alira was present, not because she sought power but because no one dared exclude her after what she had done. Some listened to her in silence, others still held doubts, but all understood that her words carried the weight of the one who had stood when the line was breaking. She spoke plainly without arrogance, suggesting strategies, warning them of overconfidence, reminding them that strength was not in numbers alone but in the resolve of those who refused to yield. Many who once dismissed her now found themselves repeating her words, as though her defiance had become the voice of their conscience. Among the soldiers, her presence grew into something deeper than legend. Around campfires, men and women whispered her name like a prayer, saying if she could stand alone then perhaps they too could hold fast when the tide came again. She did not ask for their faith, yet she felt it in the way their eyes followed her, the way recruits straightened their backs when she passed, the way hardened veterans gave her small nods of respect. It was not worship but recognition, a bond forged in the fire she had endured. Elira carried that bond quietly, never letting it swell her pride, for she knew pride could shatter faster than steel. Instead, she carried it like a shield, one more reason to keep standing when the time came again. But at night, when the camp grew still and the fires died low, the weight pressed down on her. She remembered every face of those who had fallen, every scream that had cut through the chaos, every drop of blood that had spilled on her hands. She wondered if she had truly done enough, or if the miracle others saw was simply luck born out of desperation. In those moments, when her armor was set aside and her sword leaned forgotten by her bedroll, she felt the quiet ache of doubt. She had held the line once, yes, but could she do it again? The enemy was not finished, and she was only one woman, fragile beneath the legends built around her. Yet each time the doubts crept too deep, she remembered the promise she made, to the fallen, to the frightened recruit who had asked her about courage, to the soldiers who now looked to her without words. She could not break, no matter the fear gnawing at her heart, for if she fell to despair then those who followed her would fall as well. The enemy struck again sooner than expected. It began with raids at the edges, swift attacks meant to bleed morale, to remind the defenders that safety was a lie. Villages burned, survivors fled, and the smell of smoke once more tainted the air. The army marched, weary but resolute, toward the borderlands, where the next great clash was destined. As they drew near, Elira walked among them, her pace steady though exhaustion gnawed at her bones. She spoke not in grand speeches but in small words, quiet encouragements given to those who faltered, a hand laid on a shoulder, a reminder that they were not alone. It was in these small gestures that her strength spread, a tide of resolve that bound the soldiers together. When they reached the valley where the enemy awaited, the sight chilled every heart. Rows upon rows of armored warriors filled the horizon, their banners snapping in the wind, their war drums shaking the ground. The commanders muttered strategies but fear gnawed at their edges. Some whispered retreat, others argued for delay, but Elira knew delay would only feed the enemy's hunger. She stepped forward, her voice calm, reminding them that retreat would bring ruin to the villages behind them, that hesitation would hand victory to the very foe they dreaded. Her words cut through their fear like a blade, not with volume but with conviction, for she spoke with the authority of one who had faced the impossible before. The council agreed at last. They would stand in the valley and meet the enemy head-on. The battle that followed was unlike the last. This time Elira was not alone. Thousands stood at her side, yet still the enemy came with crushing force. The clash of steel rang across the valley as waves of warriors met, shields shattered, arrows rained, and the earth itself trembled beneath the struggle. Elira fought in the thick of it, her sword moving with relentless purpose, every strike driven not by rage but by the memory of why she fought. Around her soldiers rallied, drawing strength from her presence, fighting not just to survive but to prove themselves worthy of the stand she embodied. The line bent but did not break, though the cost was heavy. At one point, when the enemy's cavalry thundered forward, threatening to pierce through and scatter the defenders, Elira charged alone to meet them. Her body screamed in protest, but her will blazed brighter than fear. She struck at the lead rider, unseating him, then whirled to face the next, each movement a desperate defiance. The soldiers behind her, inspired by her courage, surged forward to fill the gap, halting the charge before it could tear through their ranks. Blood stained the ground, cries of the wounded rose around her, but the line held again, not because of her alone this time, but because her courage had lit a fire in those who fought beside her. As the day dragged on and the sun bled into the horizon, the battle reached its climax. The enemy, fierce and unyielding, began to falter under the sheer resilience of the defenders. Exhaustion weighed on every limb, but no one gave ground. Elira's arms felt like lead, her vision blurred with sweat and blood, but she refused to fall. When the enemy at last began to retreat, the defenders did not cheer immediately, too drained to realize what they had accomplished. Only when the last of the enemy banners withdrew into the distance did the valley erupt in cries of victory. Soldiers embraced one another, some wept, others collapsed where they stood, unable to believe they had survived. Elira stood among them, her sword hanging heavy at her side, her chest heaving with every breath. She felt no triumph, only a deep relief that the line had held once more. Around her, men and women looked to her with gratitude and awe, not because she had stood alone this time, but because she had shown them they could stand together. She had become more than a symbol, she had become the spark that turned fear into fire. And though her body longed for rest, she knew this was not the end. The war was not yet won, but for the first time she did not feel alone in carrying its weight. She had started as one against the storm, but now she was part of something greater, a unity forged from defiance, and in that unity lay their only hope of survival. The night after the battle was heavy with silence, though the valley was littered with the echoes of war. Fires burned in scattered circles where the survivors gathered, tending wounds, sharing rations, mourning the dead. The stars above glimmered faintly through a haze of smoke, distant and indifferent to the suffering below. Elira sat alone at the edge of the camp, her armor stripped away, her sword resting across her knees. Her body was battered, her arms scarred with cuts, her chest aching with every breath, but it was the weight within her heart that pressed hardest. She had stood when all seemed lost, she had fought until the sun bled into the earth, and once more the line had not broken. Yet she could not escape the faces of those who had not risen again. Their laughter, their shouts, their bravery, all swallowed by the price of survival. She whispered their names to herself, each syllable a prayer, each breath a vow that they would not be forgotten. Around her, the army began to settle, exhaustion pulling men and women into uneasy sleep. Yet even in slumber the camp felt different now. Fear had not vanished, but it no longer controlled them. They had faced the storm and they had endured. Soldiers who once doubted themselves now bore the pride of having stood shoulder to shoulder, and even the youngest recruits carried the look of those who had seen death and refused to bow. Elira could feel it in the air, the change was subtle but powerful. They were no longer just survivors, they were becoming a force bound by trust, by courage, by the shared fire of defiance. It was no longer her burden alone. The spark she had carried had spread, and the flame now belonged to all of them. At dawn, the commanders summoned the army to speak. The general who had once dismissed Elira as unfit stood before thousands, his face hardened by years of war but softened now with humility. He spoke of sacrifice, of the miracle that had been achieved, and of the strength found not in ranks or titles but in the will to fight together. Then he turned to Elira, his voice steady but thick with respect, and named her the shield of the line, a title carried only by those who embodied the spirit of defense against impossible odds. The army erupted in cheers, some shouting her name, others raising their weapons high, their voices carrying across the valley like a tide. Elira stood in silence, her head bowed, humbled not by the honor itself but by what it represented. She had once been called unfit for battle, unwanted on the field, yet now the very army that had doubted her looked to her as their shield. Though pride warmed her heart, she remained wary. She knew titles could fade, legends could twist, and glory was a fragile thing. What mattered was not the name they gave her but the responsibility it carried. Being the shield of the line meant more battles ahead, more nights of uncertainty, more moments where fear would whisper in the dark. It meant she would have to keep standing, again and again no matter the cost. She accepted it quietly for she had no other choice. To her, the path had always been clear. When the line threatened to break, she would hold it. That was not duty alone, it was who she had become. As days turned to weeks, word of their defiance spread far beyond the valley. Messengers carried tales to distant towns and cities, and soon people began arriving with supplies, healers and volunteers eager to join the fight. They came not for gold or glory, but because they had heard of a warrior who had once stood alone and taught others to stand with her. The story grew, told and retold, painting her not as a woman scarred and weary but as an unyielding figure chosen by fate. Elira often listened quietly when these tales reached the campfires, never correcting them, though she knew the truth was simpler. She was not chosen by fate, she had simply refused to bend. Still, if the myth gave courage to others, then perhaps it had its place. Legends, after all, could sometimes inspire where truth could not. In the midst of preparation for the next campaign, Elira found herself approached by the same young recruit who had once asked her how she had found the strength to stay when all others ran. He stood taller now, his armor scuffed with the marks of battle, his eyes no longer wide with fear but sharp with determination. He thanked her, not with flowery words but with the simple honesty of a soldier who had learned what it meant to stand. He told her that in the darkest hour, when the enemy surged and despair clawed at his chest, he remembered her words, that courage was not about being fearless but about refusing to give in. It had kept him on his feet when he wanted to flee, and because of it he had survived. Elira listened in silence, a faint smile touching her lips, and placed a hand on his shoulder. For her, that moment was worth more than any title or honor, for it proved that her defiance had become more than her own. It had become a legacy carried by others. The enemy did not vanish and the war did not end. Battles continued, each one testing the limits of endurance, each one demanding sacrifice. Yet Elira no longer felt she stood alone against the storm. With every clash she saw the fire in her comrades' eyes, the unity that had once been absent. They fought not just to survive but to protect one another, to honor the fallen, to keep the line from breaking. The weight was still heavy but it was shared now, and that made all the difference. In time, songs were written of her, banners painted with her likeness, children taught her name as though it were a beacon of hope. She became more than a soldier, more than the shield of the line. She became a symbol of what it meant to rise when the world declared you unfit. Yet for Elira herself, beneath the armor and the legend, she remained what she had always been, a woman who refused to yield. Each battle, each scar, each night haunted by the faces of the lost only deepened her resolve. She did not fight for glory, nor for the songs that would outlive her. She fought because someone had to stand when others faltered, and she had long ago accepted that it would always be her. And so, though the war stretched on and the years wore heavy, the story of Elira endured. They had once called her unfit for battle, but history remembered her as the one who stood when all else failed, who held the line not with power or favor but with sheer, unbreakable will. In the end, that was her legacy, not the titles, not the legends, but the simple, eternal truth that one person's defiance can ignite the courage of thousands. And as long as that truth lived, the line would never truly break. The end.